The scary truth about obedience. Nietzsche warned you, imagine you're standing at a crossroads. But one path leads to comfort, belonging, and predictable rewards. The other leads into the unknown, where there are no guarantees, no applause, and no clear answers. Most people stand at this fork and choose the first path, not because it's right, but because it's safe, because someone told them it's the correct way to live, because it's the path of obedience. And that's the scary truth we need to talk about today. Because Friedrich Nietzsche warned us not just about obedience itself, but about what it does to the human soul. We think of obedience as a virtue. We reward it in children, in students, in employees. Obey the teacher, obey the law, obey the rules. We're trained from the beginning to follow orders, to color within the lines, to say the right things. And yes, obedience can bring order. It can create structure. But Nietzsche saw something deeper, something far more dangerous. He believed that blind obedience was the death of what makes us fully human. He said obedience dulls the will, kills the instinct for greatness, and replaces courage with comfort. And the scariest part, we're not even aware it's happening. Nietzsche didn't want a world full of rebels with no purpose. He wanted individuals who were radically alive, people who thought for themselves, who felt their own instincts burning inside them and dared to act on them, even when society said no. But instead, what he saw was a culture of quiet submission, people who outsourced their values, who let others define what was good or right or normal. And he asked a brutal question: are you living your life, or are you just following orders written by people who died hundreds of years ago? It's uncomfortable, right? Because if we're honest, most of us don't really think about why we believe what we believe. We inherited it from parents, from schools, from religion, from politics, from culture. And it's tempting to keep it that way, because thinking for yourself is hard. It's lonely. It's risky. It might force you to walk away from everything that's familiar. But Nietzsche's point was clear: if you never question the system you're living in, you're not living. You're just functioning.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
There's a story Nietzsche tells not with literal words, but through the myth of the last man. The last man is the ultimate obedient citizen. He avoids risk. He avoids pain. He seeks only comfort, entertainment, and security. He doesn't ask big questions. He doesn't strive for greatness. He just wants to be liked, to be safe, to be comfortable. And Nietzsche didn't hate this man, he pitied him. Because the last man doesn't even realize what he's lost. He's traded his potential for peace, his freedom for predictability, his soul for approval. And the terrifying part, he's everywhere. So here's a hard question: are you becoming the last man? Are you making your choices because they're true to your inner convictions or because they're socially acceptable? When was the last time you said something unpopular because you knew it was right? When was the last time you walked away from an expectation, even though it cost you something? Because if you can't remember, then Nietzsche would say you're already deep in obedience and you don't even know it. But why do we obey so easily? Why do we give up our autonomy so willingly? It's not just because we're weak, it's because we're scared. Freedom sounds great until you realize it comes with responsibility. If you create your own values, you can't blame anyone else when you fail. If you think for yourself, you might lose friends, family, or status. And so, we obey not because we're convinced, but because we're afraid. Afraid of being different. Afraid of being wrong, or afraid of being alone. Nietzsche called this a slave morality. Not because you're literally enslaved, but because your values aren't your own. You're serving someone else's ideal. You're living in reaction, not creation. You're saying yes to things you haven't even examined. And the result? A life that feels safe but hollow, predictable but numb. You go through the motions, but the fire is gone. But here's the twist. Nietzsche didn't just diagnose the problem, he offered a way out. He said we have to become the Übermensch, or overman, not a superhero, not a dictator, but someone who creates their own values. Someone who doesn't just reject obedience for rebellion's sake, but who transcends obedience by becoming the author of their own moral world. Someone who dares to ask, What do I truly believe? What kind of life do I want to live regardless of what others say? This is not an easy path. It's not safe. It's not comfortable. But it's real. It's alive. And it's the only way to avoid becoming the last man. So ask yourself, whose voice is really guiding your life? Is it yours, or is it someone else's, buried so deep in your habits and beliefs that you've mistaken it for truth? Because Nietzsche warned us, obedience is not neutral. It's not harmless. It's the quiet killer of the human spirit. The Factory of Values, How Obedience Manufactures Morality and Destroys Truth. Nietzsche didn't just critique obedience as a passive habit or a social norm, he saw it as a factory. A massive, invisible machine that manufactures our morals, our values, our sense of right and wrong. And once you understand that, obedience becomes even more terrifying. Because it doesn't just control what you do, it shapes who you are. It tells you what's good, what's evil, what's admirable, what's shameful. And most of us walk straight into that factory, get stamped with its symbols, and walk out believing we've discovered truth. But in reality, what we've accepted is manufactured morality, a morality built for control, not for liberation. Think about it. Where did your ideas of good and bad come from? Who told you what kind of life is respectable? Who gave you the categories you now use to judge yourself and others? Few people ever stop to ask that. We assume we know what's right. We assume that our values are universal. But Nietzsche exposed a brutal truth. Most of our so-called truths are historical accidents, products of systems designed to domesticate powerful individuals into obedient citizens. He called this the transvaluation of values. In ancient, pre-Christian societies, strength, vitality, power, and excellence were considered noble. The hero wasn't humble, he was proud. He didn't apologize for his greatness, he lived it boldly. But then came what Nietzsche called the slave revolt in morality. It was led by those who were weak, oppressed, and resentful. Instead of defeating their oppressors in battle, they flipped the moral code. They made humility a virtue. They called power evil. They labeled ambition as prideful and wrong. And over generations, this inversion of values became the norm. We were taught to worship meekness, to fear greatness, and to obey as a sign of moral superiority. This wasn't about truth, it was about survival. Those who couldn't dominate the world physically dominated it morally. And they did it through guilt, through shame, through obedience. What scared Nietzsche most was that this moral system became invisible. Nobody questioned it anymore. It became just the way things are. And anyone who dared to live outside of it, who pursued their own power, who created their own values, was branded dangerous, immoral, or insane. But here's where it gets even darker. Obedience doesn't just distort your values, it rewires your identity. The obedient person doesn't know they're obeying. They believe they're good. That's how the factory works. It convinces you that compliance is virtue, that conformity is kindness, that self-erasure is love. And so, we shrink ourselves. We censor our instincts. We call it maturity, or decency, or humility, but it's often just fear in disguise. Fear of standing apart, fear of being judged, fear of being free. Nietzsche's solution wasn't to tell people what values to adopt, he despised that. He didn't want to create a new religion or moral code. He wanted to awaken the individual. He wanted you to see the factory, to become conscious of the systems that have shaped you, and then to step beyond them, not in rebellion, but in creation. He wanted each of us to become a creator of values, not a destroyer, not a nihilist, but someone who digs so deep into their own being that they begin to live from the inside out, not the outside in. But how do you begin to do that? How do you stop being a product of the factory? First, you start by examining your deepest beliefs. Not the surface-level opinions you post online, but the core assumptions that drive your choices. What do you believe about success, about suffering, about love, about failure? Did you choose those beliefs, or did they come pre-packaged from your culture, your religion, your school? And if they weren't yours to begin with, why are you still living by them? Second, you practice radical honesty, not just with others, but with yourself. Nietzsche believed that truth is not something you inherit, it's something you earn through suffering, through solitude, through the painful process of stripping away illusions. You have to be willing to look at yourself without flinching, to confront the ways you've betrayed your own nature, to admit how much of your life has been guided by fear or convenience rather than truth. And third, you embrace the responsibility of freedom. Because once you step outside the factory, there's no one left to tell you how to live. You have to write your own code. That's both terrifying and exhilarating. But Nietzsche believed that's where real meaning begins, not in obedience, but in authorship. Not in being told what's right, but in becoming what's right through the force of your own will. None of this is easy. It's not supposed to be, but the alternative is far worse. A life of quiet obedience. A life of second-hand values. A life where you're good, yes, but not alive. So ask yourself, what if your morality isn't yours? What if the things you're most proud of, your humility, your obedience, your compliance, are the very things keeping you from your true strength? Nietzsche didn't want followers, he wanted creators, individuals who could shatter the factory walls not out of anger, but out of love for life itself. Individuals who could look at the world and say, "You will not define me. I will define myself." That's the scary truth about obedience. It doesn't just control your actions, it shapes your soul. Beyond good and evil, why real freedom begins where morality ends. What if everything you've been taught about right and wrong, everything you've internalized about being a good person, is not just incomplete, but fundamentally flawed? That's the question Nietzsche forced us to confront. He didn't merely want us to challenge a few rules here and there. He wanted us to burn down the entire framework. Because to him, morality, as we know it, isn't the product of truth or reason, it's the product of fear, weakness, and control. And if you want to be free, truly free, you have to go beyond good and evil. This doesn't mean becoming evil. That's the mistake people make when they hear Nietzsche's phrase. They assume it means rejecting all responsibility, embracing chaos, living selfishly. But that's not what Nietzsche meant at all. He wasn't promoting nihilism, he was warning against it. When he said we must go beyond good and evil, he meant we must go beyond conventional morality, beyond inherited categories, beyond the simplistic binaries that divide the world into heroes and villains, saints and sinners, good citizens and lawbreakers. Because those categories, Nietzsche believed, blind us more than they guide us. Think about it. How often do we judge others and ourselves based not on what's deeply true, but on what's socially acceptable? We say someone is bad because they broke a rule, even if that rule is unjust. We say someone is good because they followed the rules, even if doing so made them complicit in something cruel. We follow laws not because they're moral, but because they're laws. We obey authority not because it's wise, but because it's authority. And we rarely stop to ask, what lies beyond this system? What happens when I stop letting morality be handed down to me from above and start creating it from within? This is where Nietzsche's vision becomes truly radical. He believed that the highest form of human life is not the obedient servant of a moral code, but the creator of values. The person who has faced the abyss of meaninglessness and chosen, despite it, to give meaning to their own existence. That's not a license to do whatever you want. That's not freedom as indulgence. It's freedom as responsibility. It's not a comfortable life, it's a courageous one. But why is this so hard for us to accept? Because morality gives us safety. It gives us structure. It gives us a sense of superiority. We don't just want to live, we want to feel justified in how we live. We want to know we're on the right side. But Nietzsche tears that comfort away. He shows us that every moral system has a history, a motive, a bias, a shadow. And if you trace it back far enough, it often leads to power, fear, and control, not truth. So what do we do without morality? How do we live without the compass we've always relied on? We create, we become the compass. We look deep into our own being, our instincts, our intuition, our capacity for love, strength, courage, and beauty, and we forge a path from that. We don't mimic the values of others. We embody our own, and in doing so we become something rare, not a follower, not a rebel, but an originator. That's what Nietzsche meant by the Übermensch, the overman. Not a master over others, but a master over oneself. a being who has overcome the need for external validation, who lives not to be good in anyone else's eyes, but to be true to themselves. And that truth isn't soft, it's not polite, it's fierce, it's honest, it's alive. So let me ask you, what would your life look like if you stopped trying to be good and started trying to be real? What would change if you stopped obeying inherited values and started creating your own? What if the real danger isn't in breaking the rules, but in never questioning them? Nietzsche warned us that morality can become a cage. But it's a cage we decorate. We call it virtue. We call it decency. We call it doing the right thing. But if you never chose those bars, if you didn't build the cage yourself, then you're still trapped, no matter how noble it looks from the outside. And if you want to be free, you have to be willing to step beyond it and into the unknown, into a world without clear labels, a world where you're not told who to be, but must decide every day, from your own depths, what kind of life is worth living. That's where real freedom begins. The birth of the individual, escaping the herd and becoming who you are. There's a moment in every thinking person's life when they realize they've been living inside someone else's story. That their beliefs, their ambitions, their fears, even their sense of self have been shaped by forces they never truly questioned. Nietzsche called this the herd instinct, our deep, primal pull to belong, to stay close to the group, to avoid standing out. And while this instinct once kept our ancestors alive, it now keeps many of us trapped. Trapped in conformity, trapped in mediocrity, trapped in lives that feel hollow because they were never truly ours to begin with. To Nietzsche, the herd isn't just a crowd of people, it's a state of mind. It's the mindset that says, I'll believe what the majority believes. It's the impulse to look sideways before acting, to scan for approval before speaking, to measure ourselves against others instead of listening to what's erupting from within. And this isn't just a social issue. It's an existential one, because the more we live according to the herd, the more our individuality decays. We become echoes instead of voices, copies instead of originals. But Nietzsche didn't leave us there. He saw a way out, a path that begins not with rebellion, but with awakening. He called it becoming who you are, not who you were told to be, not who you think others will admire, but who you already are underneath the layers of obedience, fear, and imitation. This isn't a process of adding more. It's a process of subtraction, of peeling back every borrowed identity, every second-hand belief, until what remains is raw, real, and unmistakably yours. But this journey is brutal, because the herd doesn't like it when one of its own walks away. When you start thinking for yourself, people will call you arrogant. When you stop following the script, they'll say you're lost. When you start creating your own values, they'll label you dangerous. And maybe you are dangerous to the illusion that life is supposed to be safe, simple, and standardized. But Nietzsche would argue, better to be dangerous and alive than obedient and dead inside. So what does it mean to become an individual in a world built for the herd? It means choosing solitude over popularity when they conflict. It means being willing to be misunderstood, rejected, even hated for the sake of truth. It means digging into your own suffering, not to escape it, but to mine it for meaning. It means taking full responsibility for your own values, your own life, your own becoming. No excuses, no guarantees, just radical ownership. And it means facing a terrifying question every day. If I stripped away every influence, every pressure, every voice telling me who to be, what would remain? That question isn't meant to be answered quickly. It's meant to haunt you, because it's in living that question, not solving it, that the individual is born. Not the false self you perform for the world, but the deeper self, the one that grows not by obedience, but by fire. Nietzsche believed that most people will never make this journey. They'll cling to the herd because it's easier, safer. But for those who dare, those who are willing to break the spell of obedience, to go beyond morality, to turn inward instead of outward, something extraordinary happens. You stop being a reflection, and you become a source, not of chaos, not of arrogance, but of authenticity, of life, lived on your own terms. That's the birth of the individual. And it's the only life worth living,